Our scripture this morning comes from the book of Matthew and the second chapter, verses 13 through 23, as we hear what God may be speaking to us today. Now, after they had left, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, "Get up and take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt, and remain there until I tell you, for Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him." Then Joseph got up, took the child and his mother by night, and went to Egypt. And he remained there until the death of Herod. Now this was to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet. "Out of Egypt I have called my son." When Herod saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, he was infuriated. And he sent and killed all the children in and around Bethlehem who were 2 years old or under, according to the time that he had learned from the wise men. Then was fulfilled what had been spoken through the prophet Jeremiah. A voice was heard in Ramah, wailing in loud lamentation, Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be consoled because they are no more. When Herod died, an angel of the Lord suddenly appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt and said, "Get up, take the child and his mother, and go to the land of Israel, for those who were seeking the child's life are now dead." Then Joseph got up, took the child and his mother, and went to the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was ruling over Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. And after being warned in a dream, he went away to the district of Galilee. There he made his home in a town called Nazareth, so what had been spoken through the prophets might be fulfilled. He will be called a Nazarene. This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God.
I hope you all have had a great time over the holidays, the celebration of Christmas. It's a wonderful time. It is really a rich experience, I think, for us to be able to get back and be home. Sometimes not always easy, but it's good, and to be connected with family. The holidays can be stressful, though, and lots of travel, time on the road, where we have gone to visit, or people maybe have traveled to visit us. We like to go home for the holidays. Home really kind of represents maybe more an idea for us than actual a location sometimes. Although place is important, we need to know our grounding, where it is we come from, the places we are. Maybe some of you who are here today traveling and you come back home, and maybe you have kids with you, or maybe a spouse or friends with you, and you like to drive by and say, "Oh yeah, that's where we used to hang out whenever, and that's where we did this or that." That's one of the fun things about going home to the place where you're from, is to remember those things. It gives us a sense of identity and connection, our place in the world. I always knew, I grew up in South Oklahoma City. You know, we were Southsiders. That meant we weren't Northsiders, which we understood what that meant. Friend of mine who grew up in northwest Oklahoma City, vice president of a bank up there, and he said, "You know, you didn't just grow up on the wrong side of the river," because I went to Southeast High School. "You grew up on the wrong side of the tracks, too," because it was Southeast, not Southwest. Our address actually technically was Southwest, but we lived our life Southeast at the high school. We have a sense of identity by where it is that we come from, our place. And that's incredibly important. Home represents all those things. I drive around the area, around Capitol Hill, and Remember when we were visiting John Jernigan, he was at Southwest Medical Center, and the boys were with him, and I said, you look out this way, and looked out over the neighborhood, and I said, every block over there, I mowed yards on. That was my territory. I mowed yards over that area. And kind of where, if you look past over there, you can see where my grandmother, you can't see her house, but over there is where she lived. And my mom would drop me off over there because she had a beauty shop at her house, and she was working there, and most of my customers were her customers. That's how I got them. I mowed her yard, and then they would see me mow her yard, and so they would ask if I'd mow theirs. And so all of that neighborhood, my mom would drop me off in the morning, and I would push my lawnmower to all those blocks and mow whatever yards there were. Some summers I had 50 yards I mowed. I made more money during those summers and spent them like a dumb teenager would, but it bought me a car and things like that too. So we have a sense of home, our identity based upon that. Again, I'll tell you this not so you feel sorry for me in any way, because I don't want you to, that's not what I'm asking for, and I don't need that. But some Methodist clergy have a difficult time, and families, clergy, about a sense of home. As a pastor, I've served, my first appointment was in Oklahoma City, the next appointment was in Moore, and then I was in Pawnee, and then back in Oklahoma City, and then I took a job in Atlanta, and then came back, and we lived in Prague, and then now we're in Chickasha, and a lot of those center around Oklahoma City. I've been blessed among Methodist clergy to have spent most of my time in central Oklahoma. I mean, if as far east as I got was Prague and Pawnee, that's pretty close in, it's not terribly far away. And so I have a stronger sense of that identity. And here in Chickasha, to get to my mom's house, 40 minutes, I can get in the car. So there's a strong sense of belonging, connection here. But for many Methodist clergy and their families, kids who grow up in that kind of environment, they don't feel as grounded. I'll never forget whenever I was in high school and I was thinking about going in the ministry. One of my good friends, her father was a pastor, and we were talking on the phone. I remember it so clearly. She said, Scott, you don't want to do that to your family. Heck, I was 17. I wasn't thinking about having a family. And I said, well, what are you talking about? She said, well, we're probably going to move this year, and so I'm growing my strawberries in the windowsill. I don't get to plant them because I can't take them with me if I do. For her, there was a sense of being disconnected. There wasn't a family home that they were able to go to. And in a way, my kids kind of miss that a little bit, except my mom's home is in South Oklahoma City, so they have that kind of as their place to go back to. Thomas lived here in Chickasha, as you remember, for a while with us, and so maybe he feels a connection here, although since he bought his condo, I don't think he's been back to Chickasha one time. But that kind of is what happens, I guess. And just to kind of illustrate the point more deeply, I had a friend he's passed away, long gone, after retiring. And I say friend because we were at least 50 years apart in age. But he was a pastor in Oklahoma. He served at Guthrie. They had moved a lot. And back in the early days, you know this, Methodist pastors moved about every 2 years. And his family had been in a lot of places. And now one of the good things is we have our own furniture. We get to choose what couch is there. But in those days, couches and those kind of things were put in the parsonage after somebody got done with them. And they meant well. You meant well, because this is probably how it happened here some. Someone decided they would get a new couch. They were tired of their couch, but it wasn't totally worn out, so let's give it to the church. They'll put it in the parsonage, And, so you get a couch here and a chair there. They never match and things like that. And it can wear on a family. And, you think, gosh, what's he talking about? Well, how's this going to get to Christmas in any way? But So his wife and it was just hard on her, and she said, I can't do this anymore. I mean, they were in their 50s. So I can't do that. We've raised the kids, but I can't live in somebody else's house anymore. So they bought a house in Guthrie. He didn't tell his DS about it before. He just bought the house, and they moved in. Somebody in the church didn't like that they weren't living in the parsonage. The cabinet hated that he had his own house. Now, it felt like a threat to them. Will he be willing to move? And so they moved him immediately as punishment to see how loyal he was. Signed him to church out in western Oklahoma. His wife stayed at the house. They kept the house. He moved out there. The DS said, well, your wife has to move too. He says, well, technically no. I'm who you appoint here. I'll go. My wife is going to stay. Do you want to drive a wedge between us in this way? And, it was punishment. Those were rough, hard days then. He won out. The church didn't like it that he, would spend some of his time in Guthrie but live in the parsonage by himself, and that she didn't come out with him. He ended up moving back. They assigned him to a church that he could serve in Oklahoma City and drive from the home that they had bought. It was not at the salary level or those kind of things, but you make your choices, And they stayed together. They made it as a family. They might not have if they hadn't. I just tell you this because there's a sense of home that's important to all of us. And one day you're going to have a pastor and who maybe that's an issue for. I don't know. Just to help you understand the relationships that we all share with each other. And now to make the turn, if we take a thin reading of Christmas, if we just take a thin reading of the Christmas story, we see the story today, and what we see is God's providence caring for and making a way for baby Jesus to grow up. But if we look deeper, we see so much more. Remember Jesus' family, he grew up in Nazareth. It's where they were really from. But remember why they were in Bethlehem? They had to go because there was a tax. And they had to go back to their home, their family's home. It wasn't their home. They were there visiting because they were being pushed, driven by the government to return home for a particular reason. And so he wasn't born in his home. And then he had to flee. He was a refugee, political refugee, fleeing violence in the world. Had to flee to another country. Egypt, his family had never been to Egypt. They didn't, there was no connection there. They were going there for safety, to care for the family. They were trying to raise Jesus up and just to keep him from being killed. And they go to Egypt, fleeing. Egyptians didn't want him there. They didn't ask for him to come, but they found a way. They made it. They got there, and they settled for the time that was needed. And then he was able to return and grow up in Nazareth. Care of refugees is an important thing. It's not just something we talk about, but, it relates to Jesus. He was a refugee. It was important to care for the stranger among us. So important that the Old Testament law says that you have to care for the migrant who is among you, to make a place for them, to seek out their concern. And, in our day right now, there's something that seems hateful about how we view the other, about how some ways that we treat migrants today. Folks who come here, not because they necessarily want to. A friend of Anna's from school, her dad their family came here from Mexico. He opened a business in Capitol Hill right across the street from my dad's business. He did business, had my dad do his printing for him, and my dad had to learn Spanish to be able to do typesetting and all those kinds of things for some of the Mexican businesses that were there around him, and did all those things because it was important and necessary. And they kind of made a friendship. And then his daughter, just by chance, ended up in school and one of Anna's best friends. They keep in touch. A year or two ago, he decided to retire, selling his business. And he wants to move back now to Mexico. I mean, he wants to be back in his home and place. Now, his daughter, Marie, she doesn't know anything about living in Mexico. I mean, she's visited there. She speaks Spanish perfectly, but that's not her home. This is her home. This is where she lives. She went to elementary school. She's a citizen. She graduated from high school, went to OU Medical Center. I mean, this is her place. And she's like, Dad, Mom, you're going to leave me here? And y'all are going to go? And she's an adult, but this is home now, but for him, home was there. He didn't think he'd be here his whole life, They thought he would go back at some point. Our sense of place is important. How we treat folks who are here is important. Families that come to do work, often in jobs we won't do ourselves. How we treat the new resident is important. Jesus was one of those once. Remember Joseph, not his father Joseph, but the Old Testament Joseph, who his family had to flee to Egypt because of a famine. They were migrants. They were immigrants. They were refugees because of hunger in a foreign land. And because of that, we have to always remember that's our roots. That's where we come from. Anybody remember the Dust Bowl? Remember how Okies were treated in California? We were refugees, even if not us, our family. And my mom's going with us on this trip. She's got a cousin out there she wants to see, a cousin who their family went out there to get work. Her father worked as a picker because they had work to do. We know this. This is us. How we treat the refugee is how we treat ourselves. It's how we treat Jesus. Remember in Hebrews it says that it's like when we care for the stranger, it's like caring for angels unaware. We don't recognize the face, but it's in treating the least of these, we're treating Jesus. Important things about the story. If not just because it's the right thing, how about because we ourselves were refugees and Jesus was? It says that after the time had cleared up, they went home by another way. They had a different route they had to take because they were warned. I think there's something important about that because it says when we come home different. We come home different. We're changed by our life experience. When we come home, we're not the same person we were when we were in high school, before we went off to college and found our place in the world. And now when we come home with different eyes, and we see the world differently. Our faith changes us. When we see the world from Jesus' perspective, we see it differently. All kinds of things that we never noticed to begin with. It'd be so easy to miss the sense of home and the sense of being a refugee in this story. I've never thought about it that closely, honestly. I mean, I knew it was there, but I've never put my gaze upon that part of it until this week, thinking about the sermon about Jesus as a refugee. We come home changed by a different way. But the other thing it means is that we're always going home, aren't we? Our journey is to home. And that's a home that's bigger than Chickasha. It's a home that's bigger than where we came from, that our home is in God. God is our beginning and our end, and the place in which we rest, and that is our home. And it's something that we're headed to. Ultimately, that means at the end of this life, we go home to God and to life eternal. And as we do, we know our life is complete in that sense, that our home is not here, but it's somewhere beyond. One day, safely to arrive at home, right? That's where we arrive. Our home is in God. But it's also a home we carry. We carry it in our heart. It's not bricks and mortar, but it's the sense that that's where we belong and whose we are. So as we travel on our trips and we make our way back home, let it always be a reminder to us that our home is in God, in Him. And just as we travel through this life, Jesus traveled through this life as a refugee, and kindness goes an awful long way to the one who is passing through. Amen.